This is the Terracotta Army. 8,000 warriors buried over 2,000 years ago. One of the greatest wonders of the world.
This is the Terracotta Army. 8,000 warriors, buried more than 2,000 years ago, arranged in silent formation beneath the plains of northern China. Every year, millions of visitors lean over the railings of those excavation pits and stare down at row after row of clay faces, convinced they understand exactly what they're looking at. They don't. Because according to a private research team led by geophysicist Dr. Marcus Feld, there is a layer beneath the army that nobody was ever supposed to reach, and what his instruments found there suggests the emperor didn't just build a tomb. He built a vault for something he needed buried forever, and the army was never facing outward to guard him. It was facing outward to guard the world from what lies beneath his feet. Most people who visit this site fixate entirely on the warriors. 8,000 individual clay figures, each with a distinct face, spread across pits that stretch farther than most visitors ever realize. But in this telling, the warriors are only the entrance. The full underground complex is imagined to cover thousands of acres, and in this story, the research team studying its layout comes to believe the emperor wasn't simply preparing for death. He was constructing a complete duplicate of his empire underground, a backup civilization that would keep functioning even if the world above collapsed. If his dynasty fell and his enemies won the daylight, his spirit would still command an entire kingdom in the dark, permanent and entirely under his authority. That's the reasoning, in this fictional account, behind the clay stables, the bronze tools kept in working condition, the sculpted animals fired from the same earth as the soldiers. Clay birds. Clay farm equipment. Every detail of ordinary life reproduced below ground so that the emperor would want for nothing in the next world. But the story goes further than simple preparation. In this version of events, the emperor wasn't only planning for death, he was trying to outrun it. For decades he sent expeditions to the edges of the known world searching for a potion of immortality, consulting alchemists and mystics, swallowing substances his advisors swore would extend his life without limit. When those searches failed him one by one, the story goes, he turned the tomb itself into the solution. Some of the fictional researchers in this account come to believe the entire complex wasn't built as a resting place at all, but as a machine, a ritual engine meant to drag his soul back across the line between death and life. Every soldier, every channel of liquid mercury, every star painted across the ceiling of the inner chamber becomes, in this telling, a working part of that machine, a map for a soul trying to find its way home. It might sound like superstition, until you notice the precision the story insists on. The soldiers don't face a random direction. They face east, toward the old enemy territories the emperor spent his life conquering. Even in death, in this fictional retelling, he is positioned for the next war. Nothing about the arrangement is accidental, and that's the detail that convinces the investigator in our story to look past the faces of the clay army and into the darkness behind them. Dr. Feld, the invented lead of this fictional investigation, doesn't arrive at the site the way an ordinary visitor arrives. In this story, he understands the weight of what he's stepping into before his plane even lands. He isn't a man who approaches mysteries with a shovel and a notebook. His fictional toolkit is built for finding things that were never meant to be found. Scanning technology originally developed for locating buried structures in difficult terrain, instruments that read the earth the way an X-ray reads a body. In the story, his reputation in this specialized corner of applied geophysics is well known internationally, and he has worked in politically sensitive excavation zones before. None of that, the narrative insists, prepares him for what has apparently been sitting undisturbed here for decades. In this fictional account, getting access to the restricted zones of the site is nearly impossible. For years, the most sensitive sections have been kept under tight control, drone flights banned across the whole complex, every scan requiring sign-off from far above the site's own administrators. Even the archaeologists who have worked here for decades, in this telling, operate without seeing the complete picture, the information kept deliberately compartmentalized, split across teams so that no one outside a very small circle knows everything. How Dr. Feld's fictional team secures permission to go where no outside investigator has gone before is left deliberately unexplained in the story, a detail meant to unsettle rather than clarify. From the moment his team sets foot on site, in the narrative, the tension is immediate. Uniformed officials shadow every step. Equipment is inspected piece by piece before it's allowed near the pits. Every drone flight requires its own formal request, and every scan runs with someone standing behind the operator, watching the readout in real time. As the fictional team assembles its instruments inside the excavation pits, The air feels dense in a way that has nothing to do with temperature. Dr. Feld later describes standing at the center of the complex as feeling like standing in a space that was never built for the living. Not a metaphor in the story, but a plain observation from someone who realizes how few people have ever stood exactly where he's standing, and how few have ever been allowed to point instruments at what's underneath. He moves, in this telling, through chambers sealed for over 2,000 years. Clay soldiers rise on every side, some caught in a pose just short of drawing a weapon, others holding a stillness more unsettling than aggression would be. Carriages with wheels still structurally sound. Stables with clay horses frozen mid-stride, as if waiting on a rider who is never coming. Bronze blades that could still cut. Tools laid down mid-task, as though whoever was using them stepped away for a moment and simply never returned. Every pit, in the story, is a frozen moment, a room where time stopped and stayed stopped. But the fictional Dr. Feld isn't there for the artistry. He's there for what the eye can't see. His drones climb, carrying scanning instruments far beyond what a typical survey would use. On the ground, in the story, his team sweeps radar systems in careful lines across the pit floors, reading the earth dozens of feet beneath their boots. Watching the silent ranks of soldiers from above, an unease settles over the fictional team that only deepens with each passing hour. The beauty of the sculptures, in this narrative, starts to feel like it's performing a function, pulling the eye upward and outward, away from whatever sits below. Not paranoia. Pattern recognition. Something down there, the story suggests, was buried at enormous effort specifically so that no one would ever find it. The imagined technology at the center of this story is ground-penetrating radar, pulses of energy fired into the earth that bounce back differently depending on what they strike. A wall, a void, a mass of packed material. The reflections build a picture made entirely of shadows and echoes. When those images appear on the fictional team screens, the story says the room goes quiet. Walls with no match on any existing architectural record. Vertical shafts dropping what the narrative describes as over 100 feet straight down. Clusters of small, densely packed shapes numbering in the thousands that no one in the story can immediately identify. One theory offered inside the fictional narrative is that these clusters are the Emperor's personal effects, everyday objects rendered in permanent materials so they would never decay, the kind of possessions a man obsessed with eternity might want close at hand. A second, darker theory proposed within the story is that the scanners aren't reading objects at all, but the remains of an entire court, not clay stand-ins, but real attendants placed there to serve an emperor who expected service to continue past death. The deeper the fictional instruments reach, the less the underground landscape resembles an orderly complex and the more it resembles what the narrative calls an enormous, chaotic burial ground. Layer after layer of disturbed earth, deep shadows with no architectural explanation, a picture nobody on the fictional team was prepared to see. 4 years, in this story, no aircraft had ever been allowed above the site, the airspace effectively closed. Dr. Feld, in the narrative, becomes the first to fly scanning equipment above the burial complex and look down at it from altitude, using a laser-based imaging system capable of cutting through vegetation and surface soil to map buried structure with precision. What the scans reveal, according to the story, is a dense network of hidden structures far beyond the boundaries already known to researchers. Buried walls, collapsed chambers absent from every existing plan, and locations where the narrative says large numbers of people appear to have been placed into the earth at the same time. Some of these locations, in the story, carry thermal traces the fictional team interprets as evidence of ancient fires, heat events absorbed into the soil and, in this telling, somehow still detectable after 2,000 years. Then the fictional team reaches the section that stops everyone cold. Below the feet of the clay soldiers, the scans reveal clusters of irregular, disturbed voids, too chaotic, in the story, to be intentional architecture, too patterned to be a natural geological process. It's the kind of signature that, within the narrative, forensic specialists would recognize immediately: mass graves. The soil in these fictional readings shows compression and fracturing consistent with sudden, concentrated force, not the slow, even settling of centuries, but something abrupt and violent. Dr. Feld, in the story, studies the readout for a long moment without speaking. He has seen difficult data before. This, the narrative insists, is different. What sits beneath the clay army, in this fictional account, is not simply a palace for a dead ruler. It's a graveyard, and not a graveyard for people who were honored. The historical record, the real one outside the fiction, does describe roughly 700,000 laborers conscripted for construction on this scale over decades, people who traveled from across the region and, in many accounts, never returned home. Built on top of that real historical detail, the fictional narrative imagines a darker possibility, that if even a fraction of those workers were sealed inside once construction ended, the army would stand above one of the largest mass burial sites in the story's version of history. The tale that circulates inside this fictional world is that the construction project became a tool for eliminating people the emperor saw as threats, rivals, dissidents, anyone who'd seen too much, folded into the labor force under the appearance of national service, then never released once their usefulness ran out. The fictional radar data, in the narrative, makes this difficult to dismiss. Soil disturbance patterns consistent with bodies in motion, tunnels that appear sealed from the outside while people were still inside them, and, in the lower levels, signatures the story attributes to surviving metal components, imagined remnants of the mechanical crossbow traps described in old accounts, devices meant to fire on anyone who entered a sealed passage without permission. The fictional scans also turn up something no prior survey in the story had ever detected: a second structure, pyramid-shaped, packed densely with earth and buried directly beneath the main mound, hidden so completely it would be invisible from the surface. A secret inside a secret. Whatever the emperor considered most important, the narrative suggests, was buried under everything else, protected by layer after layer of stone, soil, clay soldiers, and the workers who built them. In this telling, the perfect rows of warriors above were never arranged for ceremony. They were arranged as a seal. And what they cover, the story argues, was never glory. It was the true cost of an empire built to last forever. Near the center of the fictional scan data, the team notices an anomaly that doesn't match anything around it. A single isolated void, older than the surrounding structures, dug noticeably deeper, as if whoever placed it there wanted it beneath everything else. Invisible, unreachable, forgotten on purpose. Inside that imagined void is one skeleton. Unlike the others, the story says, this person wasn't discarded. The remains are arranged with deliberate care. The bones, in the narrative, belong to a young man, probably in his early 20s, and the objects found near him aren't the belongings of a laborer or a prisoner. They're expensive, high status, the kind of possessions that, in the story, only someone born into real power would have carried. What silences the fictional team is what the imaging shows inside the skull, a bronze arrowhead driven deep into the bone, not the residue of a nearby battle. In the story, this reads as an execution, precise, deliberate, carried out on someone buried apart from everyone else, in a location specifically built to keep him from ever being found. The historical record does note that several sons of the historical first emperor vanish from the written accounts without explanation. Names that appear and then simply stop, no record of death, no record of exile, just silence where a life used to be. The fictional narrative takes that real gap in the historical record and imagines an answer for it, that the young man in the isolated grave was one of the emperor's own children, killed not by an outside enemy but by an order from within his own bloodline. In the story, the chamber itself isn't tomb-shaped at all. Its dimensions match a confinement cell, and the position of the remains suggests he may have been held there alive for weeks or months before the end came, kept breathing, kept silent, erased from the world above while still very much present in the one below. The fictional narrative proposes a theory for who gave that order: the historical successor to the first emperor, a son who took power immediately after his father's death, and who real historians have long suspected of consolidating that power through the elimination of rival siblings. Built on top of that historical suspicion, the story scans turn up several more voids matching the isolated prince's chamber. Same shape, same depth, same deliberate placement beneath everything else. As if, the narrative suggests, an entire generation of a royal family had been erased and buried beside the workers and prisoners who built their father's tomb. In the eyes of the man who took the throne, in this fictional telling, they were all equally dangerous, and in the world the story imagines the first emperor building, dangerous things went underground. Inside sealed chambers near the fictional team's central excavation site, the story imagines the discovery of bamboo scrolls, remarkably preserved, requiring the team to work inside a tightly controlled environment where humidity and temperature are held within fractions of a degree just to keep the material from crumbling as it's unrolled. What the texts contain, in the narrative, isn't a record of achievements. It reads like a record of offenses. One fictional document describes an order to bury several hundred scholars alive, not executed quickly, buried. Their offense being ideas the emperor hadn't sanctioned, ideas suggesting that other ways of organizing the world were possible. Other invented scrolls describe the systematic destruction of written knowledge across the empire, not only political texts but history, philosophy, and medicine, anything that might hand a person a framework for questioning absolute authority. Some of the most unsettling documents in the story are confessions, signed by engineers and craftsmen who worked on the tomb, listing charges that range from harboring critical thoughts to simple insufficient speed to guilt by association with someone else already accused of something. The chain of blame, in the narrative, extends outward with no logical limit. Every person on the fictional construction site watched, evaluated, one wrong word or one hesitation enough to turn a builder into part of the foundation rather than someone who built it. As the fictional historians on Dr. Feld's team read these documents aloud inside the complex, he watches the clay soldiers change in front of him, no longer works of art or symbols of military might, but a permanent garrison. Standing guard over a place built on enforced silence, there to make sure the silence holds. The invented scrolls also expand on the historical emperor's real, documented obsession with immortality. The fleet sent out in search of a legendary island where a potion said to defeat death was supposedly kept, fleets that, in both the historical record and the fictional retelling, never came back. The story offers its own dark reading of that disappearance. That returning empty-handed would have meant confirming, in front of the entire court, that the emperor was mortal after all, and that silence, once again, may have been the price of that truth staying hidden. Certain fictional passages in the scrolls resist full translation altogether, describing what might be a ritual for animating the clay figures through breath and intention, language the story leaves deliberately ambiguous, poised between literal belief and ceremonial symbolism, but confirming, within the narrative, that the emperor's faith in the supernatural mechanics of his tomb was never performative. He believed, in this telling, that at the right moment, the army would rise. At the center of it all sits a chamber that, in reality and in the story alike, has never been opened, the real, sealed tomb of the historical first emperor, undisturbed for over 2,000 years. Real soil samples taken around the actual mound do show mercury concentrations dramatically higher than anything natural, lending weight to ancient written descriptions of engineered rivers of liquid mercury built to flow endlessly through a miniature model of the palace inside the burial chamber. The fictional narrative leans into that real detail. If the chamber were opened, the pressurized atmosphere sealed inside for 2 millennia could vent outward instantly, and mercury vapor at the concentrations the story imagines would be lethal within minutes. There's real precedent, too, for the danger of exposure. When a smaller subsidiary pit was opened decades ago, painted color on the clay figures began flaking away within seconds of contact with open air, a chemical reaction triggered by the sudden shift in humidity and pressure. If the sealed chamber holds wood, silk, or painted surfaces, the story's logic goes, opening it could destroy the very history it contains in the same moment it's discovered. Dr. Feld's fictional scans of the central structure only deepen the mystery the story builds around it, matching old written descriptions closely enough that one conclusion becomes impossible to avoid within the narrative. The emperor designed this place to stay sealed. The mercury, the traps, the depth, the layers of burial were never accidents of engineering. They were, in this telling, a deliberate wall built against every future generation that might try to get in. So far, in both the real world and the fictional one, that wall has held, not from reverence, but from the very reasonable fear of what breaking it open might cost. By the end of the story, the Terracotta army stops looking, in Dr. Feld's eyes, like a monument to power or loyalty. It looks like a lid. Beneath the ranks of clay soldiers, the narrative imagines workers buried where they fell, rivals erased from the record, scholars silenced for their ideas, and a prince killed to secure someone else's claim to a throne. 8,000 fictional warriors still stand in formation, facing east, guarding a story that was never meant to have witnesses. Dr. Marcus Feld, a character built for this telling, not a real person, walks away from the site not with proof, but with a question the narrative leaves open, whether the things we bury out of fear ever really stay buried, or whether they're simply waiting, in the dark, for someone patient enough to look.